Shalom. This is Our Messiah is Jewish here on GLC, God's Learning Channel. My name is Mottel Baleston, and for many years I served as the leader of a Messianic Jewish congregation in the New York City area. I am a Jewish believer in Jesus. I came to the Lord over 30 years ago, and since that time it's been my privilege to see many other Jewish people embrace faith in Yeshua, in Jesus as Messiah, go on to follow him. In the other episodes of this program, and this, by the way, is season number 3 of our program, in other episodes we've discussed ways to equip believers, to equip Christians to understand their Jewish friends, to respond to objections that are raised to the Messiahship of Jesus. And so this entire season 3 is basically all about that. We're discussing the issue of responding to the questions that Christians have about Jewishness, about their Jewish friends or neighbors. What is it that Jewish people believe today? How are the Jewish people divided into different areas? And it's that last question that we're going to be taking up now in this discussion, because oftentimes I am approached by Christians, actually very consistently approached by Christians, and asked a very simple question. What is it that Jewish people believe about the Messiah? Or what is it that Jewish people believe about the afterlife? What is it that Jewish people believe about life before birth or life after death? These questions seem like easy questions to the one who poses them, but actually there's an old phrase that illustrates why answering these questions are so difficult. And that old phrase is kind of a humorous statement, and it says basically, every time you have 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions. A story is told that there was a Jewish man who was shipwrecked on a desert island, someplace in the South Pacific. And a rescue expedition was sent out to look for him, and they looked for months and months. And finally, the spotter plane saw his fire, and he had spelled out help on the beach, and they sent out a boat. And as they were pulling up to the island, they could see that this Jewish man had built 2 synagogues on the island. He had built 2 very rustic synagogues. And they finally got to him, gave him some water, and they said, you've been here for years. You're the only one here. Why did you build 2 synagogues? And the Jewish man responded, I would never go to that one. You always have to have something to disagree with. And so there is no standard answer to the issue of what do Jewish people believe about this issue or that issue. So why is there no standard answer? It's because Judaism is not monolithic about what it holds theologically. Now, of course, understand that I am a believer in Messiah Jesus. All 4 of my grandparents were born in Jewish villages in Europe. I was raised in a typical Jewish home in Brooklyn, New York, and had a very strong sense of loyalty to my Jewish people. But of course, in my 20s, on a spiritual search, I came to personal, born-again, saving faith in Yeshua, in Jesus as Messiah. And so I am a Jewish believer. I am happily fellowshipping with believers in Jesus from non-Jewish backgrounds. But often these are the questions that come up. What do Jewish people believe about this or about that? So really, to answer this question, we need to talk about the divisions within modern-day Judaism. And the fact that their answer, for instance, to the question of what do Jewish people think about the Messiah, completely differs whether the person is Orthodox Jewish, all the way here on the right, whether they are in the middle, conservative, or they are liberal. The differences in the answers to these questions all depend on which branch of Judaism they come from. And so that introduces this concept that there are branches of Judaism. Now, the Jewish people are one people ethnically. Science, modern science, has demonstrated what historians have always known, that the Jewish people today have descended from the biblical Israelites. In one of our other programs here on the third season, we did 2 episodes on the Khazar myth. We took up this issue of the Khazars and we shot it down literally and showed that the Jewish people are not descended from Khazars. Ashkenazic Jews are not descended from Khazars. We knew that historically, and the genetic science has now proven it. We took 2 entire episodes to demonstrate that. Please view those as well. But here we're talking about the fact the Jewish people are one nation, they're one identity. However, Jewish people vary by their levels of observance. Some are more involved with Jewish observance than others. Some are more religious. Some are more involved in Jewish religious celebration. And that is how we divide up Judaism. That's not how we divide up Judaism. They have self-divided into 3 broad categories. So let me put those categories in front of you. And even for those of you, I can well understand that now there are some people who are saying, well, why did I tune into this? I thought this was going to be a Bible program. Well, it's important because God said that he's going to use the Jewish people as the timepiece for the world. God is not finished with Israel. He's not finished using Israel as the way by which he will bring redemption to the world. Because Jesus said to the Jewish leadership, you've sent me away, I'm going to leave, and I will only return when you say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed are you who come in the name of the Lord. It's critically important for those of us who are believers in Messiah Jesus to understand where the Jewish people are today. So I'm going to be talking about some biblical history that I'm sure will be of interest to everyone. We're going to see how we went from biblical Judaism to rabbinical Judaism to modern day rabbinical Judaism. We understand that God gave the scriptures to the Jewish people, and that within the scriptures there's a smaller section known as Mosaic Law. Mosaic Law are found in 4 books of the Bible, in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you would total up all of the commands in those 4 scrolls, you would find that there are 613 commands. Some are positive commands, which say, in essence, thou shalt do this, you should do that. Others are negative commandments, thou shalt nots. Positive and negative commandments. Biblical Judaism is based upon that. Biblical Judaism is also based upon the Mosaic concept that there was going to be a single place where you would offer sacrifice. You would offer an atonement to make a covering over the sins for the people of Israel. And that one place ultimately developed as Jerusalem. God has said, I've put my name in Jerusalem, on Jerusalem. And so that is the one place of worship. That was the one place of sacrifice. All of the others were wrong, and we see in the Hebrew scriptures that wrong worship, false worship occurred on the high places. Jerusalem was the one place of religious assembly. But as we know, the people of Israel oftentimes wandered far from what God had instructed them. As a result, initially there was the Babylonian destruction, the destruction by the Babylonians of the temple there in Jerusalem. Horrific destruction that occurred in the year 586 before the Common Era, 586 BC. The Jewish people were in captivity in Babylon for 70 years, and ultimately, when the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon, they were allowed to come back. I know I'm racing through Old Testament history here, but this is the context. It's familiar to some of you, and it's brand new to others. And so the Jewish people came back into the land, but something had changed. For those 70 years that they were in captivity in Babylon, they no longer had access to a temple. The temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonians. How do you have a Judaism when you have no temple that God instructed the sacrifices to be at? So what you had developed during those 70 years of captivity was a system of religious teachers who said to the people, listen, we know that one day we'll be able to go back to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem. So in the meantime, let's not let the knowledge of the things of God pass away, but let's teach it to our children. And so teachers were appointed during the Babylonian captivity who held school one day a week, passing on Hebrew language, passing on Hebrew literature, passing on a knowledge of the scriptures to the next generation. I'm sure everyone here would understand that that was a good thing. You are the people of God, you're in captivity, you realize that you messed up because you followed pagan idolatry, and that's why God allowed the temple to be destroyed, because they had apostatized. So now you've gotten a spanking of sorts, and you're in captivity, and you know that God's going to bring you out of that captivity. That was the prophecy. We see it in Jeremiah. We see it in Daniel as well. And so the captivity was going to end. But in the meantime, we've got these 70 years. We can't lose 2 generations. So let's set up a system of teachers. Those teachers eventually became the rabbis. Initially, it was all good because the rabbis taught this book. They taught the scriptures alone. But you know, as things go on and on and on, people wander and they can drift from this book. And essentially that's what the rabbis did. They drifted. They started with the scriptures, but over hundreds of years, oftentimes they added their own teachings to the scriptures. They called these fences around the law. For instance, if we put a dot right here, and we say that right here is a law that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, prohibits you from breaking, what the rabbis would do is they would make additional rules and regulations to create a fence around that law. For instance, if the scriptures talked about not traveling on the Sabbath, not going past a Sabbath day's journey, not carrying a burden on the Sabbath, the rabbis would interpret that with dozens and dozens of additional rules and regulations. And those became fences to avoid having you fall into the original pit of breaking one of the Torah commandments. And for a while, having those additional safeguards in their initial stages seemed like a good idea. But after a while, what was a good idea morphed and changed into legalism. It changed from something that people were doing out of a heart's devotion to God and changed into something that people were doing out of legalistic obligation. Ultimately, those rules and regulations were formed into a body of teaching known as the oral law. This book is the written law. But in addition to this, the rabbis came up with the oral law, which they said was good. They said it was a means to keep the written law. However, oftentimes, the oral law would add more and more and more rules and regulations. Today, that oral law has been written down in a series of books known collectively as the Talmud. The Talmud has an older section known as the Mishnah, completed around the year 200 AD, a larger and much bigger section called the Gemara, which is in Aramaic, finished around the year 500 AD. Together, it's called the Talmud, and it looks like the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's about 30 volumes or so, depending upon the edition, depending on how it's bound. It is an ocean of work. and people literally spend a lifetime studying Talmud. The Talmud became the foundational document for the start of a professional group of teachers that initially were simply the rabbis, but eventually these teachers of the law became the group that many of you know today as the Pharisees. We see the Pharisees in the New Testament. Now, the Pharisees were a group that developed in that interim intertestamental period. The intertestamental period is that time between the close of the Old Testament canon, the last book of the Old Testament, and the opening of the New Testament canon. Sometimes it's referred to as the 400 silent years. Those 400 years were not silent at all. They're just called that because there was no writing prophet. There was no one writing books of the scripture. But much was happening. And the institution of the Pharisees were born at that time. And again, understand what I said. Initially, it was imperative that you had people to teach the Bible. They're in captivity. They're in Babylon. Wouldn't you want people to teach the Bible? If you don't know enough, you'd want the community to have Bible teachers. So there's a good reason for having these Bible teachers. But when the Bible teachers start adding their own rules and regulations to the scripture, well, friends, that's a problem. And that's what happened with this burgeoning and increasing oral law that was growing over the years. And the group of people who were the experts in this oral law in the New Testament are sometimes called the lawyers. That's some of the translations call them that. But literally they are the group known as the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the people of the book. They were the people with the Bible knowledge and all the rules and regulations. They are in distinction, they were a separate group from the priests. In order to be a priest, you had to be of the house of Levi, of the tribe of Levi. So when the New Testament opens, you had Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and you had the priests. The two of them did not get along most often. There were actually disputes between the two of them. And if you go into the history of the intertestamental period, the time period of the Maccabees and the Hasmonean house versus the Pharisees, they actually came to violent blows. And in many instances, the priestly class would ambush and kill the Pharisees. It's a strange fact of history, but it's there for all to see. So the Pharisees were often the ones who would wind up in dispute with Jesus. When Jesus would go and teach, he would teach from this book, and he would teach from this book alone. He would not add to the scripture. Of course, he's the author of this book. Whereas the Pharisees would say, how can you teach that way and disregard the traditions of the elders? Well, Messiah is above the traditions of the elders. And so that was the dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees. But these Pharisees were very large and very powerful. So let's fast forward to the year 70 AD. In that year, the temple is destroyed by the Romans. The Jewish people had rebelled against the Romans, the first Jewish rebellion, starting around the year 66 AD. Ultimately, that revolt was crushed in the year 70 AD, resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple there in Jerusalem. The priestly class, the Sadducees, the priests were the class of the Sadducees. So you had the Sadducees, who were the priestly class. You had the Pharisees, who were the teachers of the law. When the revolt occurred, the priestly class was bound together with the temple. The Sadducees were killed, all of them, during the destruction of Jerusalem, because they were based there in Jerusalem. However, the Pharisees were scattered throughout the land of Israel. The Pharisees were not dependent upon being in Jerusalem. So the Pharisees were able to survive the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, a large group of them negotiated with the Romans to leave the city and were successfully allowed to leave. So the Pharisees were one of the Jewish groups that survived the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jewish believers in Messiah Yeshua, in Messiah Jesus, were the second Jewish group to survive the destruction of Jerusalem. So, modern day Orthodox Jews are direct descendants of the Pharisees. That's the important thing to understand here. Pharisaical Judaism became the Judaism that would give to the world the Talmud. They would be the ones who would write down the Talmud. They were invested in Judaism as a religious system that was defined by the Talmud. And as a result, the Talmud became the defining document for what was thought to be Judaism over the years. For many years, the only form of Judaism that existed was this Orthodox, Pharisaic, Talmudic, rabbinical Judaism. That is normative Judaism today. It was the only Judaism that existed up until around the year 1800. So you have the Orthodox Jewish people. Today, Orthodox Jewish people are usually very easily discernible because they will often have distinctive dress, they have distinctive grooming features. For instance, Orthodox Jewish married men will most often have beards because of how they interpret passages in Leviticus and Deuteronomy to not cut the corners of thy beard. So married Orthodox men will often have beards. The Orthodox people as well will abide by all the rules and regulations of Talmud. There are intricate rules for what type of clothing you can wear, that you can only wear a garment that is of one type of thread, not mixed wool and linen, for instance. There are regulations about wearing garments with tzitzit, with the fringes, that all of the men have to wear. And so if you would go into traditional Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods, and those are most often found in and around large cities, you will find enclaves of Orthodox Jewish people. Orthodox Jewish people typically will live in enclaves, they will live in Orthodox neighborhoods because they are required to be able to walk to synagogue on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. The biblical Sabbath runs from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. That's beyond dispute. Sunday is a different day. Sunday, many regard as the Lord's Day, but it is not the Sabbath. That's a separate question from whether we're obligated to Sabbath observance. We've taken that up in other of these episodes here. And so Orthodox Jewish people are not allowed to drive on the Sabbath. That's one of the ways that the Talmud is interpreted. That means that they must live within physical walking distance of an Orthodox synagogue. And that explains why there are Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods in and around any urban area and in some non-urban areas as well. There's been a prior agreement that they're going to coalesce, that they're going to gather around a certain neighborhood. I grew up in such a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. In fact, there were many such neighborhoods in Brooklyn where you had Orthodox Jewish people. Within my apartment building in Brooklyn, there were 4 Orthodox synagogues within physical walking distance, less than half a mile. 4 Orthodox synagogues, and many of my friends were Orthodox. Orthodox Jewish people take their traditions very seriously. They keep kosher, which means that they abide by the laws of kashrut. The phrase kashrut means the Orthodox kosher food laws that we first find in the Scripture. So while Scripture tells us, for instance, that we can't eat any pork, the Talmud expands upon that and adds many additional rules and regulations, such as not even mixing milk and meat and having a certain time period where the consumption of milk and meat are separated. Orthodox Jewish people are very strict in their observance. They're very serious about it. An offshoot of the Orthodox are the Hasidic Jews. They are even more conservative than the Orthodox. The Hasidic Jews often can be spotted by their long black coats, the very long beards, the large black hats, and Hasidic Jews are very strictly in those Jewish enclaves near large cities. The Hasidim, this Hasidic group, started as an offshoot of the Orthodox because they felt that Orthodoxy was too cold and rigid, and they wanted something that was more free in its expression of devotion. And so Hasidic prayer is often spontaneous. Their worship is very joyous. The music is very praise-filled and sometimes spontaneous. And that is Hasidic Judaism. Again, in Brooklyn, I grew up one neighborhood over from a very large Hasidic enclave. So I'm well familiar with that as well. So that is Orthodox Judaism. And that was the only Judaism that existed up until around the year 1800. Again, it is the direct descendant of the Pharisees. They hold the traditions of the rabbis to be uppermost in how they live their lives. And so it's important to understand that when you look at the disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees in the scripture, those Pharisees represent what is today Orthodox Judaism. And to this day, Jewish believers are still opposed by those in the Orthodox Jewish community. At the same time, please understand, I've had some wonderful, warm, friendly conversations with people who are Orthodox Jewish. When you talk with them personally, one-on-one, they're often very warm-hearted, generous people who are willing to discuss these things. Other times, they have not been warm. They have been very hostile toward me and have called me a traitor. Well, I'm not a traitor because Jesus is the Messiah. So those were the things we discussed. When we come back in this second episode on this subject of the divisions, the three branches of Judaism, we're going to discuss the other branches, the conservative and the reformed. So come back to see that next episode. Shalom.